We are reading Goh Chok Tong's new memoir, Tall Order. It's a page-turner that takes us behind the scenes of Singapore's second Prime Minister's ascent to the role in 1990, a role he served until August 2004. And joining us is the man who documented Emeritus Senior Minister Goh's life and career. He's a former Straits Times news editor, and he gave the world a terrific other #1 bestseller, Neither Civil Nor Servant, the Philip Yeo story. Welcome, Peh Shing Huei.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here, Michelle.
Great to have you with us. So I understand, and you say in the book, in fact, that Mr. Goh was reluctant to write his memoirs. Why is that?
Well, I think that when he stepped down as Prime Minister in 2004, many Singaporeans, including myself, we were expecting him to write his memoirs pretty much like his predecessor, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. But we waited, and it's been 14 years, and no, he had no plans to write that. So this has been a long time coming, and at the launch of the book on November 8, he did explain that he felt that if he were to write his own memoirs, the inevitable bias would come in. And so given that, unlike Mr. Lee, what he's gone through, most of the meetings were minuted, he thought, okay, if historians were to have to record his tenure as Prime Minister, there were no lack of documents. So he saw no need to actually write his own biography.
Okay, but he clearly was persuaded otherwise.
Yes, so very glad that he was persuaded, and he was comfortable with this format of an authorized biography. So what we did was to have 12 sessions with him, lengthy ones, over 2-3 hours each of these sessions, where we talked about various topics, various subjects, from the time of his birth all the way up to 1990 when he became the second Prime Minister. Okay,
so let's focus on the title. Why was Mr. Goh's rise to the top seemingly unlikely? What made it a tall order?
Well, as you shared a little earlier, I mean, he was someone who came from a really poor background, and he had no guanxi. He didn't know anyone, no connections whatsoever. And if we compare it to leaders from developing countries, especially those around us, you'll find that most of these leaders actually do have some kind of connections. They know someone. They belong to a certain privileged background or families. That's not the case for Goh Chok Tong at all. So he really was just as common Singaporean as many of us.
Yeah, in fact, I hear speaking at the charity launch of his autobiography, Mr. Goh said his generation enjoyed meritocracy and social mobility put in place by the government, nurtured by society. He said, a government bursary paid my way through university. My life turned out well, not just because of my own effort, but also because of our practice of meritocracy. I did not have to rely on guanxi. I had equal opportunities to study, compete, get a job, do well on my own. I'm curious, in this book, is there a sense that Goh thinks meritocracy is under threat in some ways and therefore needs to be highlighted?
I don't think we have gotten to that part of the story of Goh Chok Tong yet, because we have 2 volumes here. So this is merely the first volume where we trace his early life. And I think what is important here with regard to meritocracy is really how he benefited from the system that was built by his predecessor. And he felt a need that I should step in, I should contribute, even though I have really no inclination towards politics in my early years. But his views about meritocracy today, I think we are likely to explore that more in Volume 2.
Does this book share how Mr. Goh was perceived by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew?
The perception, the views of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew towards Mr. Goh, I think those that they have been really well documented, But what this book brings to Singapore literature, to our understanding of Singapore politics, really is what Mr. Goh feels towards those comments
the
made
reactions.
the reactions towards what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had to say all those years ago, you see, because up to this point, we didn't really know how he felt when when Mr. Lee said what he said,
Yeah, I wonder if we can take listeners to 2 particular incidents. So one is, in my mind, when Mr. Goh receives an infamous book written by Machiavelli, and that book is handed to him by Mr. Lee, the Prince. And he writes, and I read, he comments after that, he says, the fearsome style of rule was not his preferred way to lead. What do you think that episode shares about his leadership style?
I actually chose to start the book with that episode because I thought that really summed up the governing style, the leadership style of Goh Chok Tong. So he was given this book by this very powerful man to say, hey, you got to kind of instill some fear into your people. And after reading it, he put it aside and said, I'm sorry, but it's just not me. So many Singaporeans, or most Singaporeans, will be familiar with this tagline of sorts of Mr. Goh, kinder and gentler. And that really is the way of governing that he would prefer. Instead of being feared, let's go for something a little bit softer. He felt that Singaporeans were ready for this style of governance.
In fact, in the book, we read how kinder and gentler was a phrase that Mr. Lee didn't quite like Mr. Goh using, because it reflected not only on a perceived weakness in Mr. Goh, but also could reflect on a perceived weakness of the party at the time. It's very apparent in this book that Mr. Goh is open to having himself, portrayed sometimes in even unflattering terms, warts and all, so to speak. So I'm just curious, you are a former Singapore Literature Prize winner. To what extent was Mr. Goh open to you characterizing him?
So I was given pretty much free rein to sculpt this book, how I would like it, the structure of the book, how I would like to tell the story of it. And at no point did he tell me, hey, can you make me look this way or that way? And my approach from the get-go was, I'm going to tell the story of Goh Chok Tong. And the story of Goh Chok Tong has got to include things which everyone faces, mistakes, pitfalls, just things which are not that glowing all the time, because you're not a Superman. You can't always be doing the right things. You can't be someone who has never suffered any failures. I wanted to capture that, and I devoted significant chunks, I would say, of the book to some failures, including things which he himself said that he felt humiliated by. There was no glossing over of these episodes at all, because I believe that when you capture that, you let the reader have a better sense of just who really is this person.
Do we get a sense of, how exactly Mr. Goh managed his relationship with Mr. Lee? So just to come back to that book, The Prince, which is the first episode that you highlight in this book. Mr. Goh receives this book. He says, this is not me. And then in the book, he talks about how he didn't have to sort of say no to his mentor, and yet he managed to walk his own path. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and exactly. That, I think, is the style of Mr. Goh. He's not a very confrontational person. And he explained as well, if I had gone back to him, meaning Mr. Lee, and said, hey, I don't agree with you, I'm going to do it another way, chances are they're going to end up fighting. Because he knew what kind of person his predecessor was like, right? But instead he said, okay, I'm just going to do it my way, quietly, take my time, So he has his own style. He has his own way, and he knew how to get about that, to go about his own way without leading to some kind of outright clash with Mr. Lee. And that, I think, really speaks of the political acumen of this man.
It's a terrific book. We're going to come back with a reading of Tall Order, the Goh Chok Tong Story. Peh Shing Huei is my guest today. We'll be back after a check on traffic.
Make sense of dollars on Money FM 89.3. Read with Michelle Martin.
We are reading the much talked about authorized biography of Emeritus Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong, titled Tall Order, Volume 1. It's a book that's already raised $2 million for two charities that Goh Chok Tong founded. Joining me is the man behind the book. He's also a former Straits Times news editor, Peh Shing Huei. Goh Chok Tong was the unlikely civil servant who rose through the ranks to become Singapore's second Prime Minister. His achievements are well known. Not so much known about his relationship with the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and the inner workings of the two men at the top, as well as how they came to terms with dealing with each other and state affairs. Tall Order recounts many of these interactions, how Mr. Goh became Prime Minister under Mr. Lee's often critical eye, with his son waiting in the wings. What's also in the book, the famous put down by Mr. Lee at that 1988 National Day rally when he revealed that Mr. Goh wasn't his first choice because he wasn't decisive enough. Mr. Lee followed it up a week later with that infamous wooden comment suggesting Mr. Goh could see a psychiatrist for his public speaking difficulties. The book is peppered with behind-the-scenes sort of scenarios like that. And I think it's an incredible addition to our understanding of Goh Chok Tong, and it manages to add to, quite a large narrative that has already been in existence. Joining me is author and former Straits Times editor Peh Shing Huei. Shing Huei, when you think about what you can bring to the narrative of Goh Chok Tong taking over from Lee Kuan Yew, how did you approach bringing new information to light? What did you want to do, and how did you achieve that?
Well, I approached the book as a journalist. The whole idea was to make sure that I write a book that is not just bought by people and put on a shelf because it is a book of a former prime minister, and hence we, as a family, we had to own it, but a book that they'll buy and they'll read. And hence I wanted to be sure that the book will include things which many were not familiar or knew of Mr. Goh Chok Tong. And actually that wasn't that difficult because Mr. Goh, despite being a public figure, he has been fairly low profile in terms of many parts of his life. He didn't really share much about his family background he is, after all, a fairly private man, which I thought was really remarkable for such a public figure. And hence, in the 2 weeks or 3 weeks since this book has been launched, I really, the number one feedback that I've been getting from readers have been, I did not know. And you can fill in the blanks after that. I did not know that he lost his father at such a young age. I did not know that he was the man behind MediSave. I did not know, and it goes on, you see. So that's where I realized that actually, really, the story of Goh Chok Tong has not been out there enough.
Yeah, did that surprise you in your literature research that so little has been written about him up to this book?
Well, one of the first places I went to was one of our public libraries. So, and I saw shelves after shelves of books on Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and then I saw only 3 books on Mr. Goh Chok Tong. 2 of them were coffee table books, largely made out of photos, and the other was a remarkable book written by scholars, but they were largely about policies during those years when he was prime minister. So I realized that there really hasn't been much about the man who he is, what were his thoughts about all these things that he has seen, that he has actually started in Singapore. There's so little written about him. Sure, I mean, you'll find it in news reports, but, as a newsman myself, news reports, they come and go really, really quickly. Nothing really solid that would stand the test of time and be placed there for reference for years and generations after that.
I'd love to give listeners a sense of the books that we feature. I wonder if you could read a little from the book. Tall order.
Sure. I'm going to read the opener from chapter 10, which is titled "This Is In Me," and this is really that famous 1988 National Day rally. So let me start. Goh Chok Tong settled into an upholstered red chair in the front row of the Kallang Theatre, a seat which he had become accustomed to for some years. As the heir apparent to Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, he had been taking prime spot among the 1,800 in the audience for the annual National Day rally speech. The event, unique to Singapore in its style and length, had become a national tradition, a platform where Lee addressed the country on major challenges and policies. After more than a decade in the crowd, Goh had also picked up some useful habits before the annual proceedings. For one thing, he made sure he visited the toilet before he entered the auditorium, knowing full well that few bladders could withstand the oratory tour de force of Lee, an uninterrupted lecture in 3 languages which could last up to 4 hours. It was no different this year. In August 1988, sandwiched between Lee's wife and fellow Cabinet Minister Tony Tan, Goh was comfortably dressed in a light blue short-sleeved shirt and dark pants. He knew what Lee was going to speak on. As First Deputy Prime Minister, he had a sneak preview of the speech when Lee asked for his views and corrections, if any. But Lee was known to ad-lib liberally, and Goh knew that those were usually the most colourful, at times humorous bits of the speech. He did not bargain for what was to come. After touching on corruption, birth rates, westernization, and a host of other issues, Lee reached the end of his speech. He cautioned that his concluding note was a sober one. Yes, we have done well. Yes, there's a team in place to provide continuity, he said. But I want to add a caveat. I don't want to be blamed if anything goes wrong. I have done my best, and I think this is the best in the circumstances, he said. He then gave, for the first time in public, his appraisal of Goh and his batch of so-called second-generation leaders, shocking Singaporeans when he said that Goh was not his first choice. I put Tony Tan number one because although Goh Chok Tong has got a faster mind, and he has a fast, quick brain, there's a decisive quality about him, referring to Tony Tan, said Mr. Lee. He listens, takes all points of views and decides. After listening, you can't keep on listening. After listening, you sit down and you listen to your conscience, your judgment, and you say, right, we will do this. And if it's wrong, I will take the responsibility. I told Goh Chok Tong, look, you're trying to please too many people. Even the pressmen, they badger him. He keeps on obliging with answers. I said, just cut them off. The crowd laughed, and Goh, who was ranked second by Lee, smiled awkwardly. But in his first extensive comments on the incident in 30 years, he revealed he was shocked by Lee's bombshell. He said, I was perplexed, stunned, and dumbfounded by his revelation. You have to live with the awkwardness of facing the big crowd after the rally. You had to be very wooden when you came out.
Tremendous. That's Peh Shing Huei there, reading from his book, A Tall Order. It's the Goh Chok Tong Story, a memoir that Shing Huei put together. Okay, Shing Huei, do you think this book shares quite a bit about the transition of old guard to new guard? Does it have any, does it resonate, especially today, given, we're looking at a transition to the fourth generation leadership? What did Mr. Goh's accounts of political renewal, what stood out for you when he talked about that?
The key theme of this book is political succession. So without planning to be, it's turned out to be fairly timely given that what we're seeing with the impending, I would say, handover to the fourth generation of leaders. So what we have learned about political succession from this book, from Mr. Goh, really is that even though it was well planned by Mr. Lee, it was still a painful process where Mr. Lee had to really get his old guard cabinet ministers to retire, and the kind of unhappiness that came out from those who had to step aside. So we got a better understanding of what happened behind the scenes in the PAP, not just with the old guard ministers, but also with the old guard MPs who had to move aside. And today, I think when it comes to every general election, when we look at PAP and they retire a good 25% of the MPs, nobody even raises an eyebrow anymore because we're kind of used to it. But this story really brings us back to when it was first started and how awkward and how difficult it was.
In terms of the details and the drama and the hints of intrigue of the story of Mr. Goh as Prime Minister, can you share an example of a story that hasn't been part of the popular narrative, something that gives us insight into Mr. Goh's leadership approach?
I think referring to the previous bit that I just read out from the book, I asked Mr. Goh, so when that was said by Mr. Lee, what went through your mind and what went through your mind in the days ahead when later on he said that you're wooden, you had to see a psychiatrist and things like that. So for the first time, he revealed that he wondered if Mr. Lee was going to remove him as first deputy prime minister and have someone else instead. He never really confirmed his suspicion with Mr. Lee because very quickly his 2G leaders, Dr. Tony Tan, including present Prime Minister Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, came out publicly to support him and said, we are still behind Mr. Goh Chok Tong as our Prime Minister, as our leader. But that was his suspicion, and it really shows you the amount of intrigue, if you would, when Mr. Lee dropped that bombshell in 1988.
It's a great book, and the photos are terrific as well. I mean, the photos of him as a young groom sitting in a rented apartment with his young wife. And I understand the Marine Parade version of this book has even more photos.
Yes, that's right. So we're going to launch the Marine Parade edition of the book this Saturday in Marine Parade because that is the political base of Mr. Goh. And with that, you're going to get more photos, largely centered around his time in Marine Parade. And it's a limited edition, so if anyone's interested, head down to Marine Parade this Saturday.
It's a terrific book. Thank you so much for bringing it to life here with us.
Thank you.
That's Peh Shing Huei there, the man who put together Tall Order, the Goh Chok Tong Story. It's a terrific memoir, sure to hit the #1 bestseller list, so you want to get it while you can. This is Read. I'm Michelle Martin.
Money FM 89.